Thank you for coming. This is a panel put on by the Platypus Affiliated Society, UC Santa Cruz chapter. We are an organization that is basically dedicated to hosting the conversation on the left. We put on teach-ins, we publish a print review, and hold public forums such as this one on the topic of the left and climate change. So we have our panelists here who will each have around 6 to 8 minutes to give their opening remarks to a prompt, which I'll read shortly. And then the panelists will have around 2 to 3 minutes to respond to each other, followed by a Q&A from the audience. Without further ado, I will read off the prompt the panelists are responding to. Every year since 2019, there have been thousands of strikes across the globe calling for policy changes to address climate change, accompanying anxieties about capitalism's ability to guide humanity into an environmentally uncertain future. At the same time, we have seen an increasingly active and visible subset of climate activists resort to more extreme measures, such as attempting to vandalize famous pieces of art or gluing themselves to motorways during rush hour. While these tactics may garner a great deal of attention, the stated goal is typically focused on rather narrowly minor changes in the environmental regulatory laws of specific regions. Amidst the proliferation of activity, it remains unclear how climate activism might lead to something adequate to the global tasks looming over humanity. How does climate activism relate to greater political and social concerns? What should a left response to climate change look like? The order of the panelists will be Logan, then Joshua, then Shasta, then Jack, then Andy. So Logan, could you give us your opening remarks?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Logan Haug. I'm a member of the steering committee of the UCSC Climate Coalition. I'm the president of Students for Climate Justice. I'll start off today by simply stating that climate change is a present and urgent threat, one that is acting currently. It's not some far-off distant threat in the future that we need to worry about 10, 20 years. There are effects that are happening now, and they are documented. I hope that this should be fairly obvious to you, given the pretty heavy stack of IPCC reports piling up, essentially saying that we're on our way towards 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees warming if we don't have urgent and overwhelming action taken by an international coalition of governments and the multitude of interdisciplinary scientific knowledge. With that point, I'd like to say that it's the opinion of a lot of people opinion of climate justice advocates and leftists that capitalism is pretty horrifically bad for our planet. Climate change is pretty much caused by capitalism's desire to deliver profits to its shareholders. Because of the notion that capitalism must continually grow in order to be successful, it has caused immense amount of colonial and anthropogenic warming amongst the earth and a bunch of other terrible injustices that are honestly too much to even list out in this brief remarks. I'll now read a quote from an author named Andreas Malm in his book Fossil Capital that I think pretty well illustrates why capitalism is contributing so harshly to the warming and the climate change effects that we're seeing across the world. Capital is not a being endowed with a will and mind, a cabal, an almighty conspiracy, or a central directory preparing its decisions and foreseeing their consequences, anything but. It is a blind process of self-expansion, but one personified in capitalists, whose actions and reactions are, and have to be, animated by the compulsion to valorize value. And that's really one of two central effects that I think makes capitalism uniquely harmful to our planet. One, that it must deliver value to the shareholders at the expense of nature. And two, that capitalism views nature purely as an economic input and does not value it for the being that it is. Secondly, I'll just say that the domination of the third world, I think you spoke briefly about how the third world is yet to develop. This is there's several effects that are documented fairly well in Malm's book about how the development of those nations through acquiring labor from their populations through foreign corporations essentially is very carbon intensive because the cheapest infrastructure to set up is highly carbon intensive and usually coal. So typically when we're looking to develop, or when, I'm not doing this, but when corporations are looking to develop third world nations, they do it at a very highly carbon intensive way because it's the cheapest way to do it. The fundamental takeaway from this is that capitalism has a very documented abusive relationship to nature because it doesn't view it as an independent being, and it typically tends to externalize all of the negative effects outside of any sort of economic predictions, and that's extremely harmful to nature. So obviously, because capitalism is the dominant economic system of at least the Western world, that sort of points the question, where does this exactly leave us as leftists, as progressives, as liberals? And Naomi Klein, I think, has a very good response to how climate change shapes the urgency of progressive demands, and I'll try and read it really briefly to you. She says in her book, Capitalism versus the Climate, which was published in, I think, 2008, responding to climate change requires we break every Nile in the free market playbook, and that we do so with great urgency. We will need to rebuild the public sphere, reverse privatizations, relocalize large parts of economies, scale back overconsumption, bring back long-term planning, heavily regulate and tax corporations, and even nationalize some of them. Cut back military spending, recognize our debts to the global south. Of course, none of this has a hope in hell in happening unless it is accompanied by a massive, broad-based effort to radically reduce the influence that corporations have over the political process. So this also means, at a minimum, publicly funded elections and stripping corporations of their status as people under law. And in short, climate change supercharges the pre-existing case for virtually every progressive demand on the book, binding them into a coherent agenda based on clear scientific imperative. And this is really how I think climate change has to interact with, especially leftists and progressives, people left of the Democratic Party. It's that it's abundantly clear to at least people on the at least to climate justice activists, at least to indigenous people, that capitalism is the thing that's causing climate change, and it's the thing that is not meeting our human needs, and it is the thing that is destroying nature. And so in order to stop all of that from happening, we need to look at ways to not reform the system, but replace it with something that doesn't have this fundamentally abusive nature towards nature, and one that isn't going to harm the earth in order to deliver value to its shareholders.
All right, thanks, Logan. You're kind of coming to time, so I'll have to cut you
Cool.
off around there. And I neglected to introduce all the panelists, so if you could just introduce yourselves, perhaps, when it's your turn to speak. Next up, we have Joshua.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the delay. My name is Joshua Cardoza. I represent the California United Front. The U.S. government, if it is not plain obvious by now, is entirely captured by corporations. Our energy, food, medical, military, and technology is each controlled for profit. These are deeply entwined due to our financial capitalist system and large financial systems owning many companies and each of the necessities for modern life that I've listed. Due to this, our resources are not focused on preventing unnecessary waste and improving the life of the American population, but instead on what is most profitable. The $110 billion of U.S. taxpayer dollars pledged to Ukraine between these last 2 years doesn't make it clear war is the most profitable. War is a racket. Wise words from Smedley Butler, a man who sought to redeem himself for his record of pushing the U.S. imperialist agenda in the early 1900s. This racket the U.S. pushes is one of the greatest pollutants in the world, and if it were a country, the U.S. military would be ranked 47th in CO2 emissions. The ability of the military to change the environment is incomparable because of the greatest climate changer, the nuclear bomb. We are on a death march through proxy wars, pushing countries to nuclear armament. Internationally, we see the focus of climate change activism in Western society towards reducing people's access to their basic needs. The reduction of greenhouse gas by scaling back Dutch farms and reducing the number of cattle, thus limiting food resources. The closures of nuclear reactors in California, replacing this with renewable energy that each impact the environment negatively while not coming close to the efficiency of nuclear fusion, all under the guise of trying to prevent environmental catastrophe. The same has occurred in Germany, where they are suffering energy shortages due to their compliance in the war in Ukraine and the U.S.'s sabotage of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, sending them spiraling back to using coal to generate the power they need. The misguided nature of climate activism has proven that at best it is ineffective at actual change, and at worst serves the rich and powerful's agenda, the Great Reset, the oligarchs' plans to push human depopulation. The Great Reset is unfolding regardless of anyone's intentions, and climate activism removing our access to efficient means of energy, turning our food supply of high-quality and complete proteins into incomplete plant-based meals only serves this purpose. Human innovation is the answer here, not the reduction of the human population. Countries striving to expand high-speed rail or acquiring helium-3 for nuclear fusion and to generate an abundance of energy are advancing a human race towards a sustainable direction. Revolution is the answer here, politically and technologically. We must organize the things we need to survive around the needs of our communities and the working class. Energy, food, medical services, military, and technology must not be driven by a profit motive. This is what climate activism must strive for. The onus is not on citizens as individuals to flail madly in a system against us, but to unite to combat the biggest threats to our well-being, which are global financial institutions plundering us through green fascism. Human innovation is something sought by China and is nearly unparalleled in the world. China is the most active in addressing climate change, committing an unparalleled $75 trillion towards it over the next 30 years. They combat it in multiple ways. First is through renewables and nuclear energy, making up close to 40% of their energy production, and shifting coal from 80% of energy production to close to 60%. Their coal production itself actively uses carbon capture and storage technology, which can harness CO2 emissions and store them to be reused. They seek advanced technologies to improve the energy, such as their small modular reactors that can be easily transported and provide energy for any locations needed, such as a factory. Finally, you can see the way they have sought to improve their environment because they processed the world's garbage for many years, and they're combating desertification in incredible ways, such as their efforts to create lush environments in places like the Gobi Desert. We cannot think backwards. We cannot move backwards. There may be people in this room today that think it's okay to limit the human population, glue themselves to roadways, or to explode trucks full of cattle. How do you expect to convince the working class of this being necessary for their survival? This may be a useful tactic to some in the West who already live comfortable lives, but those in abject poverty or from the global South do not have these luxuries. I will not be the one to tell people you will own nothing and be happy. That is the job of the filthy rich who are part of groups like the World Economic Forum and should never be any of ours. I will not tell people they cannot consume meals that are staples in their culture, meals that bring their families into beautiful traditions where they celebrate togetherness. The professional managerial class and the intellectual class who attend colleges and educate and construct curricula may be able to afford electric vehicles and think it's fine to continue to increase Elon Musk's monopoly on green transportation and forget about some of the most efficient forms of transportation available, the form of high-speed rail, a project largely neglected due to our unstable political atmosphere. The same people may be able to stomach switching their diets to carb-based meals full of calories, insufficient nutrients, and incomplete proteins, but this is unrealistic from the majority of the world and the citizens of California and the U.S. who want to live healthily and prosper. The United States needs a government of action that serves and is run by the working class. Only then will we be able to command resources to protect our environment and mitigate climate change. When oligarchs like the ones of the World Economic Forum want us to have nothing and limit the population of Earth while they fly around the world in their private jets to push their agenda, it's time for us to unite and to push back. When the technical director, CNN, Charlie Chester, which is a corporate captured mouthpiece for the CIA, military-industrial complex, and the oligarchs, tells us behind closed doors that their agenda is to hammer home climate change, we need a hammer back. No one is more capable of this than us as Californians, stewards of the Garden of Eden and trendsetters for the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. Next up we have Shasta.
Hi, I'm Shasta. I don't represent any organization. I speak for myself. Thank you all for coming here. I imagine most of you come to this panel for reasons that drove me here. The crisis of the climate has become palpable and ingrained into the experience of the world, be it prolonged political crisis, increasingly spectacular and uncanny weather events, or in our engagement with constant media that tells of a globally distributed catastrophe and a grim future. Tales such as 30 million people displaced in Pakistan last year are made mundane by repetition and inaction. And every year is replete with natural disasters. These challenge our understanding of an old regime by which the demands of capital and the conditions of labor produce suffering and death. Here where we live, many of us have witnessed the preceding year of drought and now find ourselves experiencing an historical series of storms. Should this batch melt the snowpack in the Sierra, we may be left in a deep crisis that demands its place in the annals of world history. So without even touching the topic of nature or the great extinction of the Anthropocene, I must say that I often struggle with much grief over the climate crisis. And at times, I fear that my generation will be one of the last to walk this earth before the event horizon of some great collapse. Perhaps this is the narcissism by which anyone in history can conceptualize themselves at the end of an era, or perhaps my projection into the future comes only from the ignorance inherent to living in the global north. In theory and practice, the paramount question has always been what is to be done. I will get to this, but first we must consider the Marxist orientation that this panel is organized around. We believe that a new age must come in which the contradictions of capital have been overcome and that we can all live as humans in a world that is no longer foreclosed by the overwhelming inhumanity that pulses through all that is. In tackling these issues of the climate, we find ourselves at a great series of risks and conjunctures. Could effective action around the climate legitimize individual states in the global system of capital? Does this even matter? The systems that we have are already illegitimate on any theoretical level, and it doesn't get rid of them. There's also the risk that symbolic actions will legitimize just the system as such, and our current system of production and the world order will not change. In general, the left must come to an agreement as to how to properly integrate the contradictions of the environment into the greater contradictions of capital. Now to speak of practice. While climate change is a universal crisis, its effects and the forces of historical necessity are not evenly distributed. National or global revolution around this issue, or in general, seems improbable right now. We can continue to make demands of the state and the international order, but so far, this has not appeared to be effective and is inherently contained by the limitations of capitalism. The most logical answer to resolve a crisis in production is by seizing the system of production, but we all know the history of this impulse. So, like most of us, I struggle to answer the question of what is to be done. We are deeply hindered by our ability to engage in and maintain mass mobilization. It is here that we could try to imagine a logic of decentralized action which can both halt the dynamo of capitalist profit, which drives the contradictions of both climate and the capital. In my heart, there is enough anger for what should not be and enough love for what should be that a framework of revolutionary terrorism can at times appear quite romantic and appealing. One could imagine a world in which countless actors strike at various sources of petroleum and agro-industrial production and consumption, and perhaps even the occasional oil baron, by targeting infrastructure and major sources of demand, such as the engines of shipping vessels. It is possible to imagine that the freely organized subjects of historical necessity could sufficiently hamper the profit of the global regime of petroleum profits. I'm sure, but despite its problematic nature, both on the left and in general, this is a question worth considering. I digress from this consideration by re-articulating the seemingly impossible challenge of this crisis and the world system behind it. Without any promising practice to make material changes, we are left with pockets of personal and communal resilience. And action around this includes the process of grief, integration, and adaptation. These are also possible without a unified subject that can engage in a mass movement. Perhaps this is where one should look if they do not wish to carry the world on their back. Yet I quake, as I am unsure what good this will do. The turn inwards suggests the turn inwards may come of a grim suggestion that capitalist reification, fear, and panoptics have colonized the space in our hearts devoted for brotherhood and sisterhood, and that the universal struggle has been vulgarized into a mere scattering of the individual trauma of being human.
Thank you, Shasta. And next up we have Jack.
Hi guys, so I'm Jack Mehta. I'm a former UCSC student, come back up here to talk as a member of Platypus about the relationship between climate change or environmentalism and the left. And I have a pretty simple question to ask, which is socialism the solution to climate cataclysm? The left seems to think so, right? I'm sure a lot of people in this room seem to would agree with that notion. I'm a little bit more uncomfortable, but I do want to go through some sort of arguments for why, what about socialism might emancipate us or save us, right, from death, right? So Heather Lewis, who's a member of the International Marxist Humanist Organization, wrote an essay for one of their books called Ecology and Life in the Pandemic, where she talks about capitalism as a sort of as a force that creates pandemics, right? Which is arguably a part of the climate, right? It's part of the environment at the very least. And she has to say of cholera that it was brought about by capitalism, and or the cholera pandemic in India specifically. And the way that she makes this argument is she says, well, without dense concentration of people together in cities, high levels of poverty coupled with inadequate sanitation, and the increased ability of individuals to travel throughout the world spreading disease, this pandemic could have never happened. And yet, I read that, and I find myself thinking, well, isn't the dense concentration of people in cities, one, historically progressive, and two, not something that socialism can or maybe even wants to meet? For the second, it's like, yes, poverty is bad, and it will be ameliorated under socialism. That you can't really poke any holes in. But then the increased ability of individuals to travel throughout the world spreading disease is also not just a characteristic of capitalism, right? And we also see this through historical analog with the Black Death. So the notion that pandemics, right, epidemics, are a particular feature of capitalism seems to be sort of contested ground, right? But then what about, not the pandemic, right, which is maybe the most recent environmental catastrophe in our minds, but perhaps not the most pressing one in some sense? And for that, I would turn to Tina Landis's work for the Party of Socialism and Liberation called Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism, which is more or less a manifesto laying out what's at stake and what can be done, right? And it can also sort of be read as a pitch for what if the Party for Socialism and Liberation gets what they want and takes state power? Here we see degrowth even where they claim to not be proposing it, at least in my view. The neo-Malthusianism is sort of infected even in these notions of creating a new, radically different means of producing energy, where cutting production and consumption is always the guiding force, right? They say it's specifically key. And they also decry, the sort of individual choices of people who are currently modern day subjects, right? People who live in society and want certain things. One thing she takes a sort of a stance on, an attack on, right, is this particular area, is lawns. So in suburban sprawl all over the world, there are these massive lawns that need to be irrigated.
And there's all this water use and energy that goes into making sure these lawns look nice. And under socialism, surely we would all have naturally sustainable gardens with native plants in our yards so that we wouldn't have to waste all this water on lawns. And I read this and I thought to myself, but what if the proletariat wants a lawn? Which I think really points to the question that is raised by the relationship between socialism and the environment, which is socialism, as it was historically understood, is about the accomplishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And the entailed thing here is that the proletariat necessarily has a reified consciousness, which is to say that their consciousness is a consciousness of bourgeois values, bourgeois rights, and freedom, right? And those things, while they may be actualized under socialism in a way where they do encourage people to meet climate crises, they may not. And that is, I think, an open question that we should not foreclose, right? And yet there is this massive part of the left that seems to think that socialism is the good thing and not a particularly instantiated historical phenomenon dealing with capitalism as a crisis and bringing that crisis to a further, greater expression, a deepening of crisis in order to overcome it, right? This is the Marxist conception of what the socialist movement might mean, at least historically understood, right? And we see this problem today, right? There's this sort of, there's this quotation from a recent piece written by some Panelist members that I like to read called The Vicissitudes of the New Deal, where they sort of ponder like, well, what does the working class want in this present moment with regards to the environment? And they are like, discontent among workers with environmental degradation has persisted to this day. But what failed to materialize is not only any widespread militant opposition, but any challenge to the enduring political organizations of the mid to late 20th century. In fact, today, working class people are more likely to oppose environmental regulation as it tends to increase costs to workers and reduce the profitability of the firms they work for. On environmental questions, working people around the world may, in fact, be more closely aligned with the position of capitalists than those of would-be socialists. Why is this, right? Why does it appear that in one breath, socialism is the solution to humanity's existential crisis, and yet the people who would be the vehicle for that solution do not appear to want to meet the crisis in the way that the socialists do, right? And all of this is speaking to a pretty clear absence, which is to say a political party that can mediate the will of the working class with the intellectual desires and the hopes and the utopia of would-be socialists, right? People who are interested in the idea, but in some sense, not for what it was historically, but rather what the promise was, right? The shining city on the hill, the paradise brought into reality, right? And I think that they get at this sort of question of like, well, what about why the working class wants what it wants? Like, what is this problem? Through this interesting quote from Andrew Feenberg, where he's from his 1970 essay, Beyond the Politics of Survival. The human species is not yet the subject of the struggle to survive. And so this struggle itself becomes a facet of the contradictory impulses of the very class and national struggles, the obsolescence of which it demonstrates, right? And what that sort of sentence is trying to say, to my understanding, is that humanity, not yet being the subject of history, indicates that there is this problem with attempting to save something which perhaps in some sense should not be saved, right? That the goal of socialism as a conservative impulse, an impulse to preserve, is actually only one part of the dialectic, which is to say there is also a destructive impulse to socialism. That would mean the fundamental reordering of human morality and the way in which we relate ourselves to nature, which does not seem to be taken up by an ecological socialist left, to my understanding.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah. Am I done?
Yeah, you just, perfect.
Oh, cool.
And now, we can save the applause till everyone's, finished with their opening remarks, or the Q&A starts, but now we have Andy. Can you introduce yourself, Andy?
Thank you. Andy Szasz, my name. I started teaching at UC Santa Cruz in 1986, teaching sociology, later transferred to environmental studies. I'm an environmental sociologist. I've studied environmental movements, green consumption, toxic regulation, a whole bunch of things. And recently, past 8 years or so, studying climate issues. A lot of good things have been said, and some questionable things as well. Let me sort of start by looking at the science. So there's a couple of articles that were published in the last few years that I think define the problem that we face. We already know what 1.5 degrees of Fahrenheit increase has done with the fires, strange weather all over the world. Yesterday, Greenland was 50 degrees warmer than it is on average. Instead of being 10 degrees Fahrenheit, it was 60 degrees Fahrenheit in early March. And that's just one little indicator of a system that is already spinning out of control. I've talked to climate scientists. There's one who retired from Boulder and lives here. I've gotten to know him. He tells me that there's no way on Earth, even if we stopped emissions now, that we could hold increases to 2 degrees centigrade. It's going to go higher than that. It's going to go at least to 3 degrees centigrade. What does that mean? So the two articles that I want to, I can, if you write me, I'll send you the references. They're both in a journal called PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences. One of them authored by a guy named Steffens and Johan Rockström. These are Swedish scientists who have studied planetary limits and how we are exceeding planetary limits. This article is about what they call hothouse Earth. So what they say is that for hundreds of thousands of years, Earth has cycled through ice ages, and between ice ages, oceans rising, oceans falling, temperatures rising, falling. We are now being kicked out of that cycle by carbon emissions. The danger being that we are going to be thrown into a new cycle, which is historically unprecedented in human conditions, in human existence, in which we have sea rise, we have higher temperatures, we have essentially a hothouse Earth condition. That's a disaster for human civilization of an unprecedented scale. Another article in PNAS had to do with looking at what happens to the Earth in, let's say, 2070, I think the date was, unless conditions are addressed, business as usual. And first of all, they drew a picture of the Earth. What they said was that human beings, as flexible and adaptive as we are, so people living in the Arctic and etc., most human beings throughout human history have lived in the kind of, not the tropical, not the cold, but in the temperate zones of Earth. And if you look at where life is physically unlivable for a human being, that people just simply cannot expel all the energy that heat is putting in their bodies. Right now, there's 4 little spots, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, which a human body cannot live with. But if you project forward the kind of impacts, by 2070, there's going to be a large swath of the Earth that has those conditions. Currently and projected to have between 1 and 3 billion people who are going to be on the move. Where are those people going to go? They're either going to die or they're going to be migrating. They can't migrate south. If you look at the planet, there's Antarctica, there's the southern oceans, and there's little bits of Africa, little bits of Latin America. All the available land for people to move away from the heat is up. Siberia, Karelia, Canada. We already know what politically has been the impact of people migrating in the tens of millions What is going to be the political impact of 3 billion people trying to move to a different place? At the same time that coastal cities are underwater, that food production is disrupted, we're talking about major disruption of global civilization. We're talking about immense amount of hunger. We're talking about political conflict, social disorganization, civil wars, and conflict. So clearly there's a problem. So that's one fact that's in the, I mean, I don't know you guys very well, but I've got 3 kids your age, and I really worry about the kind of lives they're going to have 20 years from now. I'll be dead, okay? Or I'll be so old that, I'll only be worried about, where my next toilet visit is going to be. You know how 90-year-olds are. If my brain is still functioning, but I hope it's still functioning. So I'm not worried about me. I'll be gone, but I worry a great deal about you. So that's one fact that I deal with all the time when I think about the world. The second fact I think about is that rather than moving in any kind of progressive direction, most of the world is moving toward neo-fascism, toward authoritarianism, whether that's Russia, China, Turkey, and maybe Brazil's an exception, Hungary, which is the nation I know best because that's where I'm from originally. Authoritarianism is on the march in the United States. And the third fact, because I want to talk about like the last prompt, what should the left response be, is that the left in the US is tiny. The self-conscious Marxist left is tiny. Okay, we've got Bernie, we've got Elizabeth Warren, we've got a whole generation of progressive in your cohort, much more progressive than the next cohort. But generally, I mean, look at this room. I remember, because I was there, when millions of people turned out for Earth Day, when millions of people were marching against the war, when we were occupying administration buildings in 1969, 1970, closing down universities, definitively. I was a member of the Harvard strike in 1969. We literally, tens of thousands of us meeting in the stadium, voting person by person to how to conduct that strike to shut the university down. There's nothing like that happening right now. So the question is, what is to be done? Okay, still the question. Lenin asked. We should not be reading Lenin to find out. It's kind of too late for that. Conditions have changed. One thing about capitalism, it really is dynamic and knows how to evolve, and it's very different now than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Conditions have changed. The positive thing for me is, for a long time, I've studied the evolution of environmental movements in the United States. So you go back to the 20th century, 19th century, the labor movement was certainly a movement for wages, but it was also a movement for healthier working conditions, to clean up dangerous factory conditions. And that was successful, but it took 100 years. The Fair Labor Standards Act, which was passed in 1938, was the time that the United States declared that the 8-hour day is the normal length of the working day. It took 100 years of struggle to shorten the working day to 10 hours and then shorten the working day to 8 hours. In the cities, I mean, if you think cities are filthy and unbearable now, which they are, you should have seen the 19th century industrial city. I mean, there were horses dying, pigs running around, eating a shit, bad housing, lousy housing, substandard housing, garbage being thrown into the streets. It took a social movement to clean up the industrial city. So social movements actually work. It takes a lot of struggle, it takes a lot of organizing. But where are the social movements now? There is a climate movement. And if you ask me what the question is, what the left should do, is it should be in coalition with other movements. there's too many times in history in the last 100 years that the left has torn itself apart. Communists against socialists, against social democrats, and we've been more focused on our differences. Trotskyists and Maoists and Stalinists and etc. fighting each other over little differences. I think that we need to find commonalities, and we need to find commonalities with anybody who has similar interests to ours. If our interest is in organizing to save the planet, then we have to join with a lot of people that we don't agree with in order to forge a social movement powerful enough to at least slow down. I mean, one of the things I think we need to
I'm going to
do...
have to cut you off, Andy, because you've exceeded the time.
Can I finish my
You can
sentence?
finish the sentence, though, yeah.
Is that, there was this debate on the left about reformism versus revolution. In the short run, the revolution is, I'm sorry, it's not on the horizon. As much as we love eco-socialism, not going to happen anytime soon. So our task, I think, in the short run, is to delay the disaster moment so that anything that can, that you were talking about sequestration, right? Anything that can slow down the march toward an unbearable rise in CO2 temperatures is something that we have to join with others to accomplish so that we buy ourselves some time before the disaster happens. So we can talk about it some more later, but thank you again for inviting me to give you a talk.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
All right, so that now brings us to a stage where panelists are open to respond to other panelists' remarks. Basically just going to go like sort of popcorn method here, where if someone has a response they'd like to deliver, then...
Go in the order they
Go in the order.
Go in the order? Okay. All right, then first up will be Logan to respond to any of the other panelists for 2-3 minutes.
Sure. I suppose I'll respond to Shasta and the notion that sort of this eco-terrorism elimination of like various oil production sort of stuff seems appealing, but in reality is totally unrealistic. And I would unfortunately have to agree. The fact of the matter is that the state has a total monopoly on violence, and if you think running a progressive electoral campaign is very hard because you don't have enough money, just wait until you try and fight a state military without any money. You will be slaughtered. And unfortunately, if there's one thing that capitalism is very good at, it's making a lot of guns. And so no system is going to let itself be dismantled without defending itself. And just so happens that the capitalists happen to own the entire military-industrial complex. So it's a very troubling thing when you want to think about this thing that is destroying the climate also is the most well-equipped to defend itself. The solution to this, I really couldn't tell you, but I can tell you my best approximation at anything the working class could do, and that would be to work on building labor power within our workplaces, and we need to see a rise of militant unionism quickly. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, the state monopoly on
No,
power.
let's go in order. So,
Okay, sorry.
Okay. So I'll start by responding to Andy in stating first that about authoritarianism. Every government on this earth is authoritarian. It's a matter of who has the authority. Is it corporations? Is it oligarchy? Is it structured around benefiting the working class? Who is the person in authority there? It's an inevitability. If the only way you don't have some type of authoritarianism, authority, is if you don't have a government. And in the topic of seeking, politicians, every left politician serves corporations. They serve them first and foremost. There's very little that we can do because they directly collaborate with the ruling class and not the working class. We cannot turn to any politicians for help in this. We can see that in how our war machine has only continued to expand. Obama taking us from 2 wars to 7. All the Democrats laying complacently while we continue to fund the military-industrial complex. And another topic, mentioning the 19th century, food was more sustainable there because, as he was talking about, animals in the streets, that kind of thing. There was also in-city farming, so people could have the animals, pigs, chickens, sheep, and they could also spread that within their community to meet their needs. And it was due to the rich placing laws, pushing because they didn't want this filth in the cities, so on and so forth, that we took a step back to now depending on corporations more for our food. And finally, we must expand past the left. As he said, we have to work with people that we don't agree with. And of course, that expands past to whether you're a Marxist-Leninist, Stalinist, Maoist, Social Democrat. This includes people in the center, people on the right. A wise man, Grigory Dimitrov, he was the leader of the Bulgarian Communist Party in the 1940s. He said, you have to meet people where they are. He was one of the few people that they were one of the few parties that successfully combated fascism in their country. And he wrote an excellent book on the United Front, where he talked about different conditions in different countries and how they either succeeded or failed in combating fascism. And an important part is to build a large, broad coalition and meet people where they are and synthesize their needs and to meet them. We cannot limit third world growth in response to Logan. We have to find ways to benefit their growth, and that means if they need coal factories in their countries, we have to allow that. But we also have to find ways in that we can have renewable energy as well to sustain them. We cannot prevent the growth of other countries. Growth is something inevitable, just like the inevitability of heating. This is something that is going to happen on the Earth. Whether or not we are pushing it forward and quicker, this is something that's going to happen. One of the greatest things is to have a government structured by the working class that wants to be prepared for it and to meet these demands. And that's what we need. We do not have that currently as long as we have a corporate captured government. They will never, ever try to meet and be prepared for these demands.
End of 3 minutes.
Okay,
Sorry.
thank you.
Next up, we have Shasta to respond to your fellow panelists.
Is this in response to things?
Whatever, anything that was brought up that piques your interest.
Yeah. I was interested to learn about the new kind of projections of what will be considered uninhabitable. It's quite terrifying. As per the question of terrorism and its interest, I cannot tell you that you can operate in this country that not challenged. And my point is not really here to promote an eco-terrorist practice, but it is to consider 2 factors, which are the factors of profit and historical necessity. And one can imagine the kind of the mandate to act when you live in an area that will become too inhospitable. The mandate to act when your son or mother or whatever dies, when it is the temperature goes beyond the human capacity for life. We deal with a force of necessity, which has no state. I can't point to unless without the most incredible Orientalism, I cannot point to a country and say that this country can materialize as subjects waging any sort of ecological like praxis upon the world. It's decentralized. There's no state. You just have people that are immiserated by capital and face the death of coming destruction by climate change. And when you have a thing that exists without a state and is driven by historical necessity, you have kind of the myriad of actors that emerge out of this. And there's the question of how this could challenge profit. And it's not going to be, or it can be, but it isn't in the force of just necessary action, assuming that this will come from mass movements in states is hard to really grapple right now. And you pretty much have this formula of people interacting with the implements of profits. The oil pipeline, the thing that drives demand, the cruise ship, the whatever your implement is, and a profit that requires this. And you just have this simple question of how can people who are too decentralized to be fully organized are faced with absolute necessity and are outside of the existence of a state or a capitalist machine. How can they interact with global profits, a global regime of profits that are driven by rents on the land propagated by geographical implements? And you have just the question of how this can be made unprofitable by these actors. And I can't answer that, but you need to challenge the profit at the source, and historical necessity needs to drive that. And if that is against the implements on the land, then that's what it must be.
Okay, thank you, Shasta. And now we have Jack. 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, so I'm not going to do a response. I'm going to attempt to very briefly complete my argument. This is why we prepare and give the speech in advance, kids. The historical basis for Marxist socialism, the contradiction between industrialization and bourgeois values, expressed the relationship between producers and capitalists, located the impetus for socialism not in the subservience of man to nature, rather the metabolic between the two, which is to say, labor. The labor puts his means of life, his labor, into an object that confronts him as valuable, more so than himself. This changes man's relationship to nature, in that nature becomes the means of life of his object, labor as a commodity, and the means of subsistence of this object as well. The problem then is not that nature is being used per se, but rather the ends to which it is being used. How Marx might have felt about climatic catastrophe isn't clear through this understanding. But it does appear that for Marx, on the grounds of bourgeois society and by extension socialism, the problem is that man's relationship to nature is transformed into an abstract relation to capital. That nature serves capital rather than man. But nature still serves in either conception, the one being the social satisfaction of the individual and the other being the same in a mediated form. At the same time, that we appear as anything other than nature is a consequence of this estrangement, for man's existence is predicated on his intercourse with nature. This nature is in fact man himself, his quote-unquote inorganic body, as Marx puts it in the 1844 Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. Yet it is just, and this is quoting from Marx, it is just in this working up of the objective world that man first really proves himself to be a species being, that is to say, a being conscious of its relation to its fellows and conscious only in and through those relationships. This is then alienated through the estrangement of labor, the crisis of bourgeois society, which makes man confront himself as an alien entity. This understanding of nature can only be arrived at through the bourgeois epoch, through the logic of the bourgeois Enlightenment. And in this logic, man is nature. To speak of the two as separate entities elides the reality that nature is an extension of man, his inorganic body, and that he should be free to make use of it as he sees fit. Notably, the reversal of this relationship plays into the crisis of capitalism, where man seems to be nature's slave. To inscribe that consciousness onto future society seems to be something of an error for the very simple reason that I personally fully expect and want humanity to have a completely different relationship to nature that is much more emancipatory than the current conception that we've internalized under capitalism. Nature appearing hostile to man is then a consequence of capitalism, but the question remains, How do we fight that? We can only fight it in and through what exists. As Lenin, sorry Andy, so instructively put it in the military program of the proletarian revolution of a different expression of the crisis of capitalism. The bourgeoisie makes it its business to promote trust, drive women and children into the factories, subject them to corruption and suffering, condemn them to extreme poverty. We do not demand such development. We do not support it. We fight it. But how do we fight? We explain that trusts and the employment of women in industry are progressive. We do not want to see a return to the handicraft system, pre-monopoly capitalism, domestic drudgery for women, forward through the trusts, etc., and beyond them to socialism. Which is really all to say, socialism does not mean the immediate cessation of capitalist crisis, rather the intensification of them with an eye towards their overcoming. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. All right, and now Andy.
Okay. I think that Marxists have always been best at critique. We really know how to figure out what went wrong. We've been less successful in figuring out what to do about it, and that's still our problem. If you look at the US right now, the fascists are much better at organizing than we are. This is at school boards, political parties, controlling the media. And so that's the problem. Given, we have lovely ideas, and I guess the one thing I will say in critique to my comrades here is try not to read your text when you do public speaking. People will fall asleep, a curtain will ring down on their consciousness, they will stop listening to you. Learn to make a notes, outline, and then speak from the outline. You'll be a lot more successful as public speakers. I'm sorry to be critical about it, but it's my experience. I really think we need to figure out how to move forward realistically in this very difficult moment that we find ourselves in. We are a minority, a tiny minority. Yes, there are people who are organizing various kind of movements in America. I think that we need to find out who they are. You guys have cited very good people. Andreas Malm, I love Andreas Malm. I like all the references. Let me give you one more. There was a guy named Wilhelm Reich in the 1930s, a German psychoanalytic leftist, who ended up in a really weird place eventually when he moved to the United States, and he discovered orgone theory and built orgone accumulating boxes and died in federal penitentiary, and the government, the FDA, confiscated all his books and burned them. But before he went, and to his credit, the same year, I think in 1933, he was both kicked out of the Psychoanalytic Association because he was talking about Marxism and revolution, and he was kicked out of the Communist Party in Germany because he was talking about sexual pleasure and orgasms as part of the liberation. Very interesting guy. He wrote an essay, which I will recommend to you, called What is Class Consciousness? You can find it, right? It's because he raised this question. He said, look, I've gone to party meetings where there are people lecturing about history and economics, and everybody goes home frustrated because, yes, they're concerned about it, but they're concerned about the practical problems of everyday life. They're concerned about family relationships. They're concerned about their sexuality. And you've got to, if you're going to organize people, you have to start with where they're at, the things that are of most immediate concern to them. You can't just bludgeon them with the correct historical materials and theory. They will not listen to you. You have to begin from their experience, almost like a therapist listens to a client. And, I've heard therapists say, within 1 hour, if a new client comes to them, they will know what the problems of that person is. But you can't just say, well, obviously the problem is your mother. You know, I say, oh God, yes, you're absolutely right. I've been liberated. No, that doesn't work that way. You have to start from people's experience and build a relationship with them. So again, I'm talking social movements and building coalitions with people. And eventually, when you build that relationship, you can say, hey, you know, this cool book by Marx, I read it, I learned a lot from it. Capitalism, that's a real problem, isn't it? But you can't start with that. So again, experience and empathy as the beginning of a relationship that builds political coalitions. We need to do that because we are in trouble politically in this country right now.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
All right, well, now the floor is going to be open to any questions from the audience. I think I'll actually start out with a question for Jack, Andy. Jack, you brought up how you have to sort of begin from what the workers want in the world when it comes to achieving socialism, and you know it can seem like these demands for like native plants instead of lawns or something like that just does not really accord to reality. And then you know, contra many people saying that socialism is going to be how humanity is going to overcome climate change. Do you think of climate change as something that's totally solvable by capitalism?
The short answer is yes. I think that capitalism, throughout its entire history, has proven its dynamism and its bona fides in that field, which is to say that all past cataclysms have been weathered. It's just meant the writing off of millions of people's lives. I don't see this being meaningfully different from, say, World War I, the war to end all wars, right? Which, as brutal and disturbing and awful as it was, did not mean that capitalism could not survive or that humanity could not survive. And you can make the argument, I think very compellingly, that that is a qualitatively different thing. And I would be willing to hear that out. I have faith, perhaps misplaced, in the ability for capitalism to weather most crises, even without resolving them. And really the point I'm trying to get at here is like, the reason that we're socialists, right, or that people were socialists, maybe to be more specific, was not because they saw a problem in the world that meant that millions of people would die. They saw a problem in the world that meant that people were miserable and unfree while they were alive, right? So the point really shouldn't be, I think, for socialism to do anything other than emancipate humanity, right? Which really has, I mean, something to do with climate change, sure, but climate change is one of these things, like anything else, that is like, it's a sort of, it feels like a trendy thing that people are concerned about that becomes something that can galvanize people to action, even where it doesn't.
Okay.
Right? Mm-hmm. So we have this sort of interesting problem where it's like the actual historical grounds for socialism no longer exist. And so we point to it not as this thing that is going to happen because there is this massive working class movement that wants it. We point to it as the good, as this thing that will save us from everything that's wrong with the world as we understand it. Which, to me, looks like adventurism. And I'm not going to sit here and claim that I'm anything other than an adventurer. But, like, I mean, I don't really see socialism having anything, maybe even necessarily to do with climate change.
Okay.
Or environmental activism.
Thanks, Jack. My question for Andy is, you sort of brought up how, you know, reading Lenin does not particularly have, you know, relevance to the situation we find ourselves in today. And I'm wondering if the history of the left, as riddled with failures as it may be, has anything to offer towards how humanity should face these epic crises of displacement that you brought up.
Oh, I think we should study both real, actual history and intellectual history. We should read all the very brilliant left theorists that come before us, because they all have something to teach us. But the reason I said, don't read Lenin, I mean, he was analyzing the situation as it existed for him, given the configuration of social classes, who had political power, what the opportunities are as society collapses at the end of a brutal war, and how you can, act within that. He was a very practical guy, and I think that's the lesson to be learned, is that you have to analyze the current conditions to know how to act within them. So I didn't mean to disrespect the great comrade. I would say, in response to what I just heard, I'm not sure what you were saying, but it sounded kind of la-di-da about World War I and, millions of people having lost their lives. And, I don't know if you've been in a war zone, but
I haven't. I'm sure it's miserable.
I was 9 years old when the Hungarian Revolution happened in Budapest, and saw people being shot and tanks running in the streets, and scenes similar to what we're seeing now in Ukraine, and people dying. And so can't be very cavalier about that, I think. I think I do agree that socialism as it was originally conceived 100 years ago, and various flavors of it, like, I've always liked the council communists or the narco-syndicalists, the people who are like the French Commune and early in Germany, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht. It's sort of like cellular control of society, cities from below. I don't think that's possible anymore. I think conditions have made that kind of vision kind of off the table. And, how do you achieve greater grassroots democracy, something like a socialist dream, with 8 billion people? I don't think anybody knows.
Right. Thank you, Andy. If any of the other panelists want to chime in on that, feel free. But otherwise, I'll open the floor to other questions.
If I could respond to Andy just briefly.
Yeah,
I agree with you. Yeah, that's all I want to say. Which is to say that, I don't really know what the current conditions for socialism are. I'm not attempting to represent myself as having any answers here.
And from the floor, gentleman in the flannel.
So I had a question for Andy specifically, I think, but it's open. So some of the things I was thinking, hearing you guys talk, was there's themes about a necessity. We see a necessity for action, right? We see a degradation of our environment, of our earth, or whatever. And then there's another question of the call to action, right? How are we gonna either organize ourselves, whether let's say like a socialist, sort of society is achieved, right? And although it doesn't necessarily have to take up, right, something like climate change. It might, right? And we see ourselves here now before, let's say, like some cataclysmic events or whatever. And we do kind of want it, right? We do want some action. Although we haven't had how Andy said, massive demonstrations, to try to get a response out of either our political system or something to kind of aid or prevent or soften the blow of ecological damage. One of the main questions I was wondering is if you were to be able to organize, for example, a strike of a pretty considerable size to get publicity or at least to try to invoke some action. I think specifically one of the things I think of is our carbon output, right? There are other sort of disasters that we could have in our environments, for example, plastic, blah blah blah, right? But as far as you were talking about the earth heating up, right? In my mind, I'm thinking carbon is probably one of the more larger problems, right? And if we were to attack it, would we have to, do you think the most pressing what's it called thing we should be facing is in terms of like cleaner energy generation? Would it be calling to action like to put restrictions on corporations and their carbon outputs? Should it be calls against like deforestation? Of course, we would want to ideally, kind of do efforts in all of those areas. But I was just wondering if there was one specific, I guess, area that we should, if there's like, for example, the research shows that, we should be protecting forests or something, right, against deforestation. Or, I don't know, I guess if we were to be able to like organize a strike for like tomorrow, let's say, ideally with millions of people, whatever, would carbon be the major focus point of what we would want to like kind of aid as far as in our environment? And even within that carbon problem we have, is there any industry or anything we could point to that may be like more pressing?
Oh, wow. It's a really profound question. So thank you. I see the greenhouse gas emissions as the killer, but not the only issue. I mean, we have soil degradation, we have water pollution, we've got plastic in the oceans, we've got toxic industrial chemicals that I studied for decades that are very poorly regulated. Better now than before 1976, but still an issue. So I can't say that there's one magic thing. It does seem to me that if you're going to have a world of 8 billion people, 2 billion of whom at least now are still hungry and still don't have decent minimum living conditions, you have to have energy. And that energy has come overwhelmingly from fossil fuels, which are, if you continue along that track, if you want the whole world to have the middle class lifestyle that we have, it's just the end of the world. So one absolute key is to provide abundant energy in a clean way. That's clearly part of the answer. It's not the whole answer. In terms of what to organize around, a few years ago there was a thing in Flint, Michigan, where they switched the source of the waters, and the water, whatever was in the water, interacted with the lead pipes, and people are poisoned, and you have to have bottled water for people, black people, in Flint, Michigan. We just had this immense spill, derailment, toxic clouds in Ohio somewhere. And every time one of those local disasters happen, people protest, people organize, they get upset. We should be going there and working with those people and legitimating their concern and helping to identify who the enemy is. It was that Republican governor in Michigan. It was that railroad that resisted installing enough hot box detectors so that you have derailments. And if you start with like showing up and being with them and sympathizing with them and interacting with them and saying to them, is that corporation? Because some of those people also blame the EPA. The government is failing us, so it's the EPA's fault for doing this. And that's the wrong construction of what really is victimizing them. But if you leave them to, if you leave it to Fox News to define what the problem is, then we have a problem. So people are insulted all the time. Their experience is of being victimized and being exploited. So that is their experience. But people don't just experience, they interpret their experience. And that's where people with a left analysis can be helpful, because they can help people interpret their experience in a way that radicalizes them further.
Thank you, Andy. Just before we ask any more questions from the audience, I know Logan wanted to respond to Joshua. And here you go, Logan.
Yeah. So I just wanted to first say that I actually do agree with you, Josh. I don't think the global south should be limited from growing in any meaningful capacity. In fact, I think quite the opposite. Obviously, their standards of living are what we would consider substandard, but for them it's totally normal. And there, I mean, I'm president of the Students for Climate Justice, this organization, and one of the main tenets of climate justice is this notion of an ecological debt that is owed by the global north to the global south, and it's essentially a form of international climate reparations for the global north emitting way more than its fair share than the global south does, and in a lot of cases, having the global south emit for the global north. And in order to rectify this, I believe it will be necessary for us to if we are going to transition to a sustainable climate just society, the global north will need to pay for the damages that it has caused by its ecological actions. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Logan. Josh?
Yeah, I agree with some of the sentiment there, and I agree with a lot about what Andy was saying, and in that, we need to stand in solidarity with these different people that have experienced environmental catastrophe. One example of standing in solidarity with people, there was the Rage Against the War Machine protest that happened recently, and sure, there's controversy surrounding that, but one of the important things is that there was one in DC, but there's also one scattered throughout California and different states. And one of the things that will make these types of organizations effective is exactly what Andy was saying. Students are being involved. And not only that, our unions are being involved, the working class and the masses. They have to be involved in these kinds of things, and we have to be reaching out to unions, to students, and synthesize this. And I believe that's an important task of the left, is to synthesize these things and to meet their needs and to find the middle ground to meet each of these groups where they're at in order to create an effective movement. Additionally, some of these disasters that happened could have been mitigated if we had a government of forethought. The rails still operating on 19th century brake systems instead of having high-speed rail. Something far more effective to transport, far more effective for our logistics. Also, the disaster in Flint, Michigan. Those pipes could have been gone almost, there could have been immediate action towards that if our Army, instead of all our funding going towards, our warmongering throughout the world, it went towards the Army Corps going out there, digging up those lead pipes and replacing them with pipes that aren't polluted, that could actually sustain that population there. So it does come back to, we need a government that thinks forward and that plans for the future, and that will almost certainly never happen under a capitalist system. Unless it's, how can we plan for a future crisis and profit from it? That's it. Thank you.
A gentleman with the long hair.
Yeah. So thanks everyone. It's been a lively and maybe provocative discussion so far. I especially appreciated Andy's remarks in that he tried to, especially the beginning, where he said, look, climate change is like a technical issue and it can be solved through technical means, and that various discussions that are more ideological in nature and more, say, sort of microsect political, like maybe try to confuse the various issues at play. It's a scientific, technical issue. And I think the other panelists, the younger panelists, tended to say that there was an ideological dimension of this. And so I guess I have two questions, one for Andy. So Andy, it seems that implicit in asserting this, it seems there was a point in time where there's been a separation, where one could perhaps, and maybe I'm like simplifying, or maybe, hopefully I'm not caricaturing, but maybe there's a point in time in history where the two got separated out, where it's like, all right, we can just tackle climate change head on. It doesn't have to be something that's addressed as ideologically or like the talking circles like the left does. And if that's the case, what point in time could we make that judgment where there was like a certain separation of the two issues, that of the left and then also addressing the technical part, climate change. And then to the younger panelists who are bringing up, more ideological issues and also like stuff within the left politically, maybe with an eye towards the history of the left. At what point could we say that the left started or came to the self-realization that it needed to be the force to take up the banner of, climate change, whether fighting it or overcoming it? Because, specific moment in time, obviously there was a left in the French Revolution, there is a dwindling left today, there's everything else in between from, say, the French Revolution until now. And so I know we heard a bit about Jack already on this issue, so it's much more so addressed to Josh, Shasta, and Logan.
Anyone who wants to respond to that? Or Andy first?
Let me just very briefly, I'm not sure I would put it together exactly that way. I think ultimately it's the logic of capital accumulation that has driven where we are right now. So it's not just like I'm into the science and then somewhere there's ideology. There's a sociological process. There's a mode of production which has a certain logic to it, which has driven over 200 years and supercharged by the discovery that you can burn coal, right? This magical substance of coal and oil. And which then interacts with the logic of capital just to speed the process. And I think the physics does come in. You have to understand at some point the non-human world, which has a certain logic of its own, where how geophysics works, right? And you have to understand both of those things simultaneously, and how those have interacted over the past couple of hundred years. So I don't think it's just science or ideology. I think you have to understand the phenomenon of our existence from multiple ways of knowing, in order to have a total analysis of how we are, where we've come to.
Shasta?
Yeah, I think finding a rupture in where climate becomes integrated into the left is somewhat, it has its flaws, because initially you have the left formulated with the same kind of heuristic as capital applies to nature. It is something that is more or less to be used for our purposes of production in a kind of a quasi-humanist materialist ideology. And you kind of have to deal with the modern promise and the modern industry and kind of the system of production that we live under and what we ascribe to that system of production. And you end up in, of course, a reified world, but a world in which just the promise of the commodity and the promise of production becomes itself problematic. Like you have in the 60s, you have Khrushchev getting on the TV with, at that point, Vice President Nixon and talking about fucking refrigerators or something like that. And you have to kind of deal with what is inherently in this reified world of production in which either production under the mode of capitalism, it means something to me, and the domination of nature under the system of capitalism means something to me, and there's a teleological purpose that comes from producing things and making profit, or you have the organization of production under communism, and there's something that comes from the replacement of the commodity form with something better, but you're still just kind of focused on this spectacle of production and making things with human labor. And I think kind of like where you could see this system, this kind of dogma break apart would be kind of just the developments in the understanding of reification and our relationship to production and in the commodity in general. And I guess like Debord would be a good like way to follow that abstract line of like what the fuck does it even mean to like to be promised something with any piece of labor that I can materialize into a concept I can ascribe some value to.
Joshua or Logan, would you guys like to? Yeah, Josh?
Sure. So hopefully this addresses your question. So from my understanding of, the historical origins of, the environmental movement comes heavily from the 60s, out of a lot of the political movements that were happening at the time. And in my opinion, it's been heavily co-opted by our ruling elites to fearmonger in a big way. Although not to say that it is a non-issue and that our climate is not changing, but they fearmonger to distract, to push a certain type of agenda, and that they fearmonger about climate change, and now we will give our money to Elon Musk for more green Tesla cars, while he then goes and starts coups in Bolivia. And so they'll jump from these different crises, the current pandemic that we just came out of, through the fear-mongering and all that, there was the largest upward transfer of wealth in human history occurred under the pandemic. So through each of these crises, capitalists see opportunity, and that as long as it is organized under them, as long as these crises are presented, they will find a way to profit from it. And so it needs to be, a lot of these things need to be taken back by the working class and by people that will rationally think, and not allow the corporations to, control the story. And it'll continue to happen with the climate movement unless we decide that we're going to organize how we're going to address it, and leave that to no one else but ourselves.
Thank Joshua. Logan?
Can you re-ask the question just really briefly?
Yeah, so at what point in time did it become apparent that the left as a force in the world had to take responsibility for the issue of climate change, whether through fighting it or overcoming it?
Yeah, well...
More specific, the better.
Yeah, so I can tell you that, just brief, American history, there were solar panels on the White House in Jimmy Carter's administration, and Ronald Reagan took them down. So I can... It's... Like with a lot of things in America, you could blame it on Reagan if you wanted to.
I do.
It's not exactly an incorrect opinion, but I think that generally speaking, it wasn't even so much the left that realized they had to take responsibility for climate change. It was more so the right realized that they couldn't act in any meaningful capacity on climate change, as it exactly counteracted every one of their political wills, essentially. I think it was some... I forget exactly the scientist's name around, but it was sometime in the 80s that a scientist presented to essentially the Congress on behalf of here's where we're at in terms of CO2, and here's where we will be he gave 3 projections, and I have a terrible memory. I totally forgot his name, but at that point in time, there wasn't any sort of pushback on his scientific research, but it became apparent pretty rapidly that the oil companies needed to sort of counteract this apparent scientific reality that the Earth was warming. And so they actually did a sort of similar thing to the tobacco industry in that they employed a PR firm to essentially sort of rebrand the narrative as something that it really wasn't. And that's really where climate denialism started. There's a book about it called Merchants of Doubt. That's very good, and I would read that one if you're at all interested. It's also a 2-hour documentary.
So I guess I emphasized these 3, but also Jack can also respond if you'd like.
Sure, I can take a crack at it. So where does the left feel the need to take responsibility for climate change?
Like the historical genesis, or like
right.
The point in
I
time.
think that, I mean, the point in time, I agree with Josh, is the 1960s, really. It's when that becomes part of the consciousness, is the need to, denuclearize, resist climate change. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring comes out in, the 70s. That's hugely formative for the environmentalist left. I think a lot of that does come out of the new left. Perhaps to tie it into what I've been maybe trying to say this whole time, and perhaps I've been putting it poorly, is an invitation to consider what is going on contemporaneously to this in socialist states, which is to say rapid industrialization and ecological destruction. So the left in America, which is trying to be different from the old way of being a socialist, rejects that sort of industrialization in some sense, right? Which may be too tenuous a connection. But I think there could be something there in the sense that, as Andy was saying, and I think as all of us have sort of maybe paid a little bit of lip service to, there has been a genuine qualitative change in what the left is and what it looks like. And that may be for the good, it may be for the ill, but it has happened, and it creates certain problems for us in the present, attempting to organize.
Thanks, Jack.
Could I just say one thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
You can go back and begin, it's a halting process. You can go back to Barry Commoner, the politically progressive scientist who began writing about environmental impacts of modern industrial production and nuclear stuff. Then, like you were saying, Jim Hansen
Thank you.
appears in front of Congress and says climate change is a problem, it's going to get worse and worse. But he didn't do it from a political point of view, but he did unleash the climate denial. And there's a whole literature now about how ExxonMobil and really billionaire conservative Koch brothers and others funded a whole movement of climate. Oh, it's not a problem. But at some point, then the self-described left began to say, the left had already started. There was a guy here in UCSC, Jim O'Connor, sociologist, who started a journal called Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, where for the first time, and he authored this notion of the second contradiction. The first contradiction in Marxism, contradiction between labor and capital. Second contradiction between capital and nature, and that's just as important. So people are beginning to theoretically talk about bringing nature into the critique of capitalism, and then slowly that's begun to be kind of more generally accepted on the left. But there isn't any one particular date that you can pick where all the scales fell off of people's eyes and people realized what was going on.
I was just wondering what you guys think about the idea of, I guess, as a matter of political expediency, the idea of untying climate concern, the climate crisis, from the left, insofar as you can appeal to the frameworks that other people already have. For example, just like you could appeal to like an anarcho-capitalist as like you're damaging somebody else's property, or you could appeal to like an evangelical Republican saying that, you know, you're coveting the world and you're bringing hell to earth, or, you know, whatever. It just seems like going to what you were saying about like, please come in. Just
Please ask your question.
It seems like by tying it to a cultural identity, you can be creating a sort of psychological resistance. And it, I mean, this is a humanitarian issue, right? Like, I mean, obviously the left, you know, you can debate, you know, the role that the leftist systems can have in addressing that concern, but I mean, personally, I think there's something to be said for the priority of presenting the evidence of what's happening and laying out just what's happening, because that's the problem to me, seems to be that people don't seem to agree on what's going on. So yeah, I guess I'm curious what your guys' responses to that idea.
I mean, if I may.
Yeah, Jack.
Yeah, it was very relevant to what you
Cool, yeah, I appreciate you asking this question, because I think it's sort of like what I've been trying to get at, which is to say,
Right.
why socialism for environmentalism,
Right.
right? And I don't know that there's like a clear answer, because what socialism is opaque, really. And what the left wants when they say socialism to combat environmentalism is opaque to me. It appears unclear. It looks a little bit at times like either anarcho-primitivism or like authoritarian state capitalism, both of which I find profoundly disquieting. So I don't really know that the left, as the historical force for the movement for socialism, really does need to take up environmentalism. I'm sort of reminded of that Eugene Debs quote, where he says that socialism has nothing in particular to offer black people. Which is to say that like socialism is a solution to capitalist crises, but it is not the solution to all crises, always, right?
Right, well, I mean, even in that...
It is a very specific, historically instantiated thing that is trying to do something. It is not like humanity being able to solve all its problems immediately.
Right.
Shasta?
Yeah. I think socialism, especially in the Western context, in the context in the U.S., does have this issue of being plagued by conceiving itself as a subculture. And like you can, like, this is very visual. Like you can find like some punky punk people that self-organize as socialists are that, and like just like archetypical, and like you're not gonna like sell like punk socialism on like Jerry and whatever the fuck going to like the church down the street with their little kids and like driving the family minivan and all that. You're not going to sell that to like the worker, and you're probably also not going to sell the same thing if you have like some flimsy people with flowers in their hair and whatever. Like you have the problem of like a left that is inherently like kind of like comprehending the condition of subjugation enough that it forms its own subcultures, and it's a crisis. And like there's something that is very powerful to to just sorrow and horror and looking outside, breathing in the harsh smoke that makes it impossible to walk up a flight of stairs, to stare into the sun that's just a red crescent, and to see just the vast inhumanity. And I think like the way out of like Flower Child Land or Punkville or like a few cranky like university professors or whatever out of the subculture is through this just like overwhelming sense of just worldly sorrow, this just at least some thin line of like human experience that is shared. I hope. I sincerely hope. And if it's not shared, if you can't like look into a blood red moon without a meaningful degree of sorrow in your eye, I'm sorry. Like, you're probably not going to be able to be organized around like the suffering of the proletariat. You're not going to be able to be organized around meaningful regulations. You're not gonna care about someone that is like killed in like a daily like accident in a Tesla factory because some bullshit. Like it's if you can't share in humanity about this, then like I don't know where we can retreat to.
Could I say something?
Yeah.
I'm an old person. I'm not sure I remember your question, but I think I remember the gist of it. The way I think about it is that, you know, no matter where somebody's coming from, if you have a shared concern, you know, we come from to climate change as an issue from our general critique of capitalism or whatever. But some years ago, I became aware of the fact that there were some religions, faith communities, first of all, Pope Francis, who wrote passionately about protecting God's creation. Also, several of the, what we think of as the traditional, more liberal Protestant churches, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Unitarians, Episcopal Church, and I went and read their literature. I talked to them. I went to ministers locally, talked to them. I interviewed. There were even some, and totally different from the Southern Baptists and the evangelicals who are into climate denial, and of course denial of evolution, and suspicious of science and suspicious of modernity in general. But there are people who come at wanting to protect the earth and wanting to save the environment, totally different place from where I'm coming from, is because they think that it's their notion of stewardship and guarding God's creation.
Right.
And it's like, to me, it's like, as a secular Jew, it's totally foreign to me. It's not the way I think about it. I talked to this one organizer, this young evangelical organizer, who for a while in the evangelical world, there was actually some pro-environmental organizing by very young people. And I interviewed the guy, and I said, well, how did you come to do this? And he said, well, I was going to seminary, becoming a minister, and one of my professors said something like, God manifests himself in two ways to the world. One way is through the Bible, and another way is through nature, because God created nature, and therefore to destroy nature is like tearing pages out of the Bible. And the guy says, and my mind was blown. And I went back and I reread the Old Testament and the New Testament, and to try, was this professor right that God wants me to care for creation? And, I thought, wow, that's a really different world than my world, because when I went to Earth Day and started being concerned about nature and backpacking and blah, blah, I said, I've got to learn the science. Is this really a problem? And the idea that you would want to go rush to the New Testament and say, oh yes, well God loves creation, was like, but on the other hand, it was like we were on the same side, opposed to ExxonMobil. And so, hell yes, I'm going to work with that person. So I think you look for commonalities or shared interests, and then through the contact, you begin to kind of be less foreign to each other, and
Right.
over time.
Yeah, I guess I find myself oftentimes concerned about divisive rhetoric on the topic. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up, but.
Yeah, spectacles. Boy.
Hi everyone, I'm Sequoia, Spectacles. My question's for Joshua. Like specifically, like in the effort of like what we've been talking about, like building a relationship with people and like finding commonalities. How do you approach from a leftist angle the like nutritional aspect of it? Because like meat being healthy is like a conservative opinion optically. And you mentioned that anything like I know like cultural standpoints was like one.
Yeah, so I myself, I was vegan vegetarian for a few years, and it was only within the last, maybe 5 years I started to switch away from that. And in that, I also started looking kind of at the diet itself, and that is, largely carb-based. Almost every source you're going to get your protein from or your nutrients from is carb. Fruits and veggies. What are that made of? That's made of cellulose. It's carbs. And so that's the difference between, and not only that, a lot of them are incomplete proteins. So you have to diversify your diet to make sure you cover all the nutrients that you get. Versus, animal protein, where that is a complete protein. And one of the things is, I guess, trying to see how I can answer it.
You kind of talked about how people would say that you can't have these traditions of your cuisine and
Right.
culture, and how that's kind of a demand that should not be in line with the left's approach towards these maybe crises of meat production.
Yes. So, for instance, a lot of those cultures and traditions themselves, a lot of them also care about using everything about the animal. Whether it's from Mexican culture, it's from Hmong culture, different cultures like that, they care about using everything about animals. So there's very little waste. And so that's an important part of it, is that a lot of these cultures, meat and the animal product itself has been a staple for them to survive. And even from deviating from that, cultures that have far less animal products have their own unique diseases associated with consuming more wheat-based products, that sort of thing, and then finding your nutrients from that direction. And so it's unrealistic to consider to have a healthy population for everyone when their diets have primarily consisted of a certain type of protein, majority from animal protein. And to switch away from that, you then open yourself up to a number of other health conditions, aside from also isolating yourself from your community and from the people around you as well, because it's just something that I absolutely experienced when I was making the change towards veganism, vegetarianism, is that isolation that you experience too. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Would you... Does it answer your question?
Yeah, no, it definitely answers my question a bit, but I'm white, I don't have any culture, I want to eat meat. What can I say to leftists that think, like, maybe the answer to that would be, oh, well, you will be part of the in crowd because we're all going to eat this way now, or something like that. Like, how do we approach it using more than an argument that is just the scientific advocacy for these things are good? How do we actually begin to bridge that gap?
Okay. So I would say one of the aspects, I guess, also is that, in American culture, health is, as much as, we suffer from obesity, things like that, there's also a desire to strive for health. It's the importance of our image, that sort of thing. And that when we start to search for other sources out of some of the things that have been primary consumption of animal product, we then start to take away from our own personal health in certain ways, whether that's nutrient deficiency. So, even us as white people, we do have our own culture, even though it's not something that can be, is recognized as other cultures. We still have certain ways that we've eaten, certain ways that we've acted, and that's primarily from, the culture that we take in, and society we live in.
Okay, thanks. Andy has to go, so he's going to say goodbye to us.
I have one last question for Andy.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Hopefully, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin, yeah.
So Andy, so I guess this is a follow-up to my first question. So it seems the younger people here on the panel have reached for ideology, and specifically Marxism in one guise or another, to address not only climate change but the ails of the modern world. And you yourself have mentioned being back at Harvard, so Madison, where there was a larger student movement, but a movement of all sorts that also took up Marxism in the 60s and 70s. And so I'm curious, as someone who's a sort of doyen and older figure, why do you think the young people have returned to it? Because it's not at all obvious if you compare the 60s and 70s versus now. Now there's the internet and different things. In the 60s and 70s, it wasn't the internet. You trained people about Marxism in person. It wasn't just scroll through Wikipedia.
Yeah, first of all, I'm encouraged that this generation, not just the people who explicitly have read Marx and consider themselves communists, socialists, whatever, but generally much more progressive on all kinds of issues than people who are maybe in the in-between generations. Do I understand how that happened? I don't. I'm very glad it is happening because I think that as now it's popular to talk about baby boomers, okay boomer, go away, die. And we were a large group of people, the post-war baby, who then, kind of dominated the culture at every stage. And yes, we're now going into nursing homes. And it's really great to see a new generation of progressive, socially caring people. I don't know, in our, I speak for my generation, it happened around civil rights movement in the mid-60s, and watching in Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, leading the local National Guard to keep little black girls out of high school, and what a shock that was, and the fight for civil rights, the Vietnam War certainly, and protesting against it was key. I remember, first of all, what's going on? I don't understand what's going on. And then somebody gave me a book to read. It was Gabriel Kolko's book, Roots of American Foreign Policy. And it was wow, the United States has been doing this globally as a foreign policy, American imperialism, American military imperialism. It's systemic. And then, slowly the analysis comes together with the activism and the protests, watching people beat up by the police, getting radicalized in that way, and then people talking, sharing readings, going to a radical professor and listening. There was a guy in Madison named Harvey Goldberg, a Marxist professor, history professor, brilliant guy, the most brilliant lecturer I ever heard in my life. 900 people would go 3 times a week to hear Harvey lecture about European intellectual history. Unbelievable. So slowly it comes together, and then you go on protests. I met my wife on a picket line. We were graduate students picketing the University of Wisconsin for better wages. And suddenly there's this person picketing next to me. Oh, nice person. But we had a way of not only being political, but the political meetings are also social meetings. So we were satisfying our social needs. Our friends, we would protest with friends and then go drinking afterwards and watch ourselves on TV. Because if you're on TV, your protest is actually happening. Right? It's real. And so we found ways of actually building a left community, which sustained us personally, even when we were not winning any of the struggles. And so if you can recreate that, and the American Communist Party did that. When I was out east for a while, somebody took me to this summer camp, which used to belong to the American Communist Party. Where kids played volleyball, and had softball and rode horses, and people had picnics, because then it wasn't just like I have to do politics for a couple of hours in the evening, either that or I have to stay home and watch TV and make that choice. But the politics for the Communist Party was a total culture and satisfied people's personal needs as well. So if that can happen here, politics isn't just something that you kind of do after hours voluntarily, but in a way it's part of your whole life. That really sustains, because struggling, I think, might, we lose all the time. Right? We lose a lot. And so you got to, in order to stay politically engaged, you have to have your needs satisfied in some other way. So, but I see that beginning to happen in this generation, and as harsh as I've been to some of the colleagues up here, some of the comrades, I'm really heartened to see your generation also being engaged in the particular ways that I heard. So thank you for inviting me. A great pleasure to meet all of you. And good luck with your efforts.
We should just do closing remarks from everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. But yeah, I think we'll have some closing remarks from everybody else who's on the panel. Logan,
order again.
Logan, then Joshua, then Shasta, then Jack.
Sure. All I'll say is that there isn't a very clear answer, because the question is pretty much designed to be impossible. The sort of reality that I'm faced with every day is that climate change is an exigent, immediate threat that is caused by some of the most powerful people on the planet, who have all of the resources and every advantage over us in every conceivable way. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, Josh?
Okay, for my closing remark, I'll actually answer a question that the fellow with the beanie asked. And it was, how do we appeal to different people for different desires to, solve climate change? And, right now there's a big question, there's a debate, is left really even anti-war anymore? When you have Congress people on the right that go and say, we need to stop this war in Ukraine. Even Matt Gaetz, he wanted to defund different sectors of the military-industrial complex. People like that are now the voice for anti-war, and that's because it's salient with their base. One of the reasons why Trump was elected was because he critiqued the Iraq War, which is something that not a lot of politicians on the left would have done. He was a voice for a lot of people that were critical of the way government's being run, especially under Obama, like I had mentioned. And I'm sure many of us know already, is that he took us from 2 wars to 7. So right there itself, there's a base there, to build this broad coalition of people to combat war. The military-industrial complex, as I already mentioned, is a large pollutant. That right there is something salient amongst a swath of the working class that we can unite against, whether you're left, right, or center. And additionally, as I said, meeting people's needs. Jack mentioned, lawns, how, there's a desire for lawns. And I myself, I live in a suburb. I have a front lawn and I have a backyard. And I hate taking care of the lawn. My parents hate taking care of the lawn. So the answer is, like Jack mentioned, our front lawn, try to put native plants in the front instead, get rid of the lawn. But also in the backyard, something for our animals to use was to replace the lawn with something artificial. So you can still enjoy the green lawn, but not have to mow it every week or every 2 weeks. Not have to maintain it. And it's human innovation to meet people's needs. And that's what we need the most, is to build this coalition amongst the entirety of the masses to answer their needs and to build a broad coalition to achieve it. And to understand that it's not going to be achieved following the line of our currently corporate captured media and government.
Thanks, Josh. Shasta?
Yeah. A lot I could say that's pretty obvious and already been said. Regards to this crisis, there is both the need to truly supplant the system of capitalism and a need to interrupt the specific dynamos of production as such, and just the tremendous amount of profit can come from killing the world. And it's hard to really say if there is a force of necessity which can bring action that would be fruitful towards this crisis, how that would emerge. It's hard to imagine that being built in a manner that fits with our imaginaries of socialist organizing. It's a terrifying thing. And I think we all just need to try to comprehend that, try to feel that. It's what makes us human.
I've got my umbrella.
Jack?
Yes. So, in closing, if socialism is something today, is something other than the dictatorship of the proletariat, then maybe we should just say so. Which is to say, what do we want is really the question that I think is posed in bringing in something like environmentalism to a discussion about left politics. What the left historically wanted was emancipation. What climate activists seem to want is something else. And that makes it an interesting category for the left to take up. And while the left historically could take up anything and everything that was an expression of a social discontent, because it could be organized in and through massive political parties, in the absence of something like that, to mediate this sort of crisis, or to give it a sort of ideological or political expression, I find myself sort of confused by why this would be something that the left would want to explicitly take up, especially when it seems that there are technological or political draconian measures that can be taken to combat it, that the left perhaps has no stake in affecting. And then the other thing too, which would sort of more be for Andy, I suppose, but as he's no longer here, I suppose I'll just speak of it, whatever. Would be that perhaps in some sense we died the moment we were born, which is maybe a too nihilistic manner of putting it. Really what I mean by that is that we will never see socialism as the salvation of humanity. It's a project for future generations, in the same way that climate science is a project for future generations. And that may map together, but the point has never been about saving us, because we may already be damned. The point has always been about creating the possibility for something new to arise out of what currently exists. And I don't really see that expressed honestly or adequately through discussions of climate crisis, which appears to me to be a conservative thing, an effort to save the world rather than to destroy it and make it anew, which is what I personally want out of socialism as a petty bourgeois intellectual adventurer. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.